Well, friends, we have a congregational meeting right after this, and we have had so much already going on today. Indeed, I feel like the sermon was already preached. The sermon was already lived. But I do want to say a couple of notes, a couple of pieces about this text before I focus in a little bit on that sermon, and then we move on to the rest of our day, the offering, the singing, and the gathering for our business. Friends, we are here continuing to be in that first chapter of Luke. We continue on with Mary and with Elizabeth. Mary goes to visit, whom we heard in the previous section, her kinswoman, her relative Elizabeth, aged woman who is also pregnant, right? As Mary has just received word that she will be pregnant as well, right? So she gathers there with her kinswoman, with her relative in our story. And I think the Gospel of Luke, the writer here, is continuing in a similar thread, that all of these stories that we've been hearing over the past few weeks are connected one to another and have a pretty clear purpose. And in case we haven't picked up on that yet, the writer gives us another sign, another symbol. What happens as soon as Elizabeth hears Mary's greeting? She says that the one inside her, she feels a leaping in her womb. The fetus jumps, right? That's what she says. And she kind of explains this, and she speaks these words that Mary is blessed. Well, I want to inform you that this is drawing on, this story, this experience, this leaping in the womb is drawing from an earlier story in the Hebrew tradition and the Jewish tradition. And that is of Isaac's wife, Rebekah. Rebekah was pregnant with twins, and she felt a leaping in her womb as well. And she went to an oracle to discover what might this mean. And she learned that it meant the second born would surpass the first, that the firstborn would indeed be in service to the second. For any of you who were here last Sunday, that should sound like a familiar message, a familiar theme between John and Jesus. Again, this writer here is trying to make very clear, it seems, to the audience, to the community, that it's Jesus who is the big deal. Jesus is the one who we're supposed to be following here. Jesus is the one who is God's Messiah, not John. It's not John. I know for us, that's not a big deal. All we do is talk about Jesus. Maybe for some of you, I talk about Jesus a little bit too much, but all we do is focus in on Jesus. But John was a big deal. John, we hear in Acts, another one, the second volume of Luke's, that when Paul was going around to proclaim the gospel, to invite more disciples, to make more disciples, he ran into some disciples of John's. That was in Ephesus. So John's message had spread. Indeed, the historian, the Roman historian, the Jewish Roman historian, Josephus, seems to have said a little bit more about John the Baptist than he did about Jesus, and people held John in very high esteem. You know, in our stories, we hear a little bit about John being beheaded by Herod, right? Because of that whole messed up kind of marriage stuff that was going on with his brother's wife. Yeah, we have some fun stories in the Bible. Well, Josephus talks about that marriage, but he doesn't say that he beheaded John because he was criticizing that. What Josephus talks about is that John was becoming too powerful, that John was amassing too big of a crowd. For those of you who have seen the movie Malcolm X, Maybe you remember that scene where Malcolm X is gathered with others from the Nation of Islam outside of a police department, and a police official says to another person, "That's too much power for one person." That's a similar thing that was going on here with John the Baptist. So perhaps he wasn't beheaded simply because he spoke out against Herod's marriage, but because he was gathering such massive crowds. And that was scary. If he had that much power, and Josephus says they seemed like they would just do whatever he wanted. Shortly after John is executed, Herod gets into a war with his previous wife's family. And Josephus says that there are Jews who said that they thought it was God getting even for John. Because Herod had murdered a righteous man. John was a big deal, okay? Again, we don't get that because we don't live then. It's all about Jesus for us. But this was a big point the author needed to make. And he does that with this leap. Again, that signifies that the second-born, John was conceived first, right? That the second-born, just like we knew with Jacob, who became renamed what? Israel. Just like he surpassed his brother, the firstborn, the rightful heir, so would Jesus surpass John. So had Jesus surpassed John. He was the one we were to be following. Another piece that sticks out to me that we didn't get really in our text today because we have a different translation that removes the language Lord because of the implications of that word, because of the use of the word Lord. But what was Lord used for in that time? Well, some like it is today in various places, but not so much here, because we use non-monarchical language for God for the most part. But Lord was the word, the name for God. The tetragrammaton, those 4 letters in Hebrew that went without vowels so you couldn't say it because God's name is too holy, was often substituted with Adonai, which means Lord. And here Elizabeth says, the mother of my Lord, the mother of my God. The writer here is having Elizabeth proclaim Jesus as God here. Because then she goes on to use the word later that the one who is blessed, the one who is filled with joy, Mary, who believed the fulfillment of the words spoken to her by the Lord is the word used here. Kurios in the Greek. Kurios, twice. God. Jesus is proclaimed as God here in this text. And I know I bristle too. Because I don't understand Jesus literally to be God. It's funny sometimes how I can pull on the metaphorical hat. I can put the metaphorical hat on in different places and spaces, just like we've been doing over the past few weeks, reading these, saying, what could they mean metaphorically? And then saying, well, here, this is a literal understanding. I bet these people were saying, Jesus is God. They thought this man was God. But perhaps, as all of the story around this seems to have deep metaphorical meaning, perhaps Elizabeth's words are meant to be heard metaphorically as well. What does it mean if we were to say Jesus is God? You know, when somebody says you are a breath of fresh air, they don't literally mean you are air. Or even fresh for that matter, but you have something in common with fresh air. Jesus has something in common with God. Jesus, I think the community is saying here that when they encounter Jesus, they encounter the core, the very nature, the passion of God, that is love, that is justice, that is truth, that is compassion, that is welcome of those on the margins, those excluded in society. That's what I think is meant here, metaphorically, to say Jesus is God. And if you say it literally, that's totally fine. You are welcome to that. But I'd wrestle myself with that. Okay, now on to the real sermon. One other piece here that connects with me is Mary's welcoming. Mary being welcomed by Elizabeth. Elizabeth offering an embrace of Mary. I heard again and again and again in our folks, our new members, who said, I'm in. I'm glad to be a part of this community. Why? Because weirdo that I am, I've been welcomed. Because this community welcomes everyone to the table. Because this community has fully embraced my children. That's beautiful. And that's what Elizabeth is doing here. She is welcoming Mary. Mary, who is a young teenager, right? She's young and she is pregnant. And according to our story, she is young and she is pregnant and she is unmarried. Indeed, she was supposed to be married, betrothed to somebody, but is somehow pregnant. She's in a very, very tenuous, precarious situation here. And what does Elizabeth do but welcome her? And not welcome her to say, oh, we need to work some things out in your life, right? She welcomes her and says, you are blessed. She sees the beauty in her. She sees her fully and wholly as a beloved one of God. Friends, you are living that as professed by those who have chosen to join the church this day. You are living that. Are we done? No. Should we just stop now? No. But Elizabeth invites us and perhaps calls us and inspires us to live that welcome, especially of those who are pushed to the margins in our society. So there you go, friends. That's what I've been thinking about today. That's what I've been thinking about this week as we've encountered just these few verses again in the Gospel of Luke. But I'll give you a brief moment to consider, to think through, to meditate on, to pray. And what is it that you are hearing? How are you being invited and called to live? What's sticking out to you? How is the divine calling to you? How is the Spirit moving you today? Friends, let us be together now. For a moment of quiet, let us be together now. For a moment of pause.